This video is meant to cover the basics of MLA style and proper citation both in text and the works cited page. The in text and works cited page is covered in much greater detail in your Little Brown Handbook, and you can find information about in text citation in section 46A, and then the works cited page is covered exhaustively in section 46B. So you'll definitely need to use that as a resource as well. There's another resource I'll show you later on in the video. It's a very good website that may be of service. So let's start with direct quotations. So there's nothing wrong with using outside quotes in a research paper or in any paper. In fact, most teachers would want you to find outside support. We just want to make sure that you use that outside support correctly. So with direct quotes, that's going to be where you're using someone else's words directly. You're going to be sure that you put those words in quotation marks. The quotation marks show that these words do not belong to you. They belong to someone else. Just a few things to keep in mind about direct quotes. There's a way to show if you change any part of a direct quote, and sometimes you may need to for clarification or something like that. Sometimes you may have to correct someone's grammar that you're quoting from. You can do so by putting brackets around anything that you insert. Now, as a reader, you should be cautious if you find a direct quote that has a lot of material with brackets around it. You have to kind of ask yourself, well, how much have they changed here and why have they changed it? Also, something that's very useful when you use direct quotes is going to be the ellipses. And the ellipses is going to be the three dots, basically, the three periods. This is going to be if you skip any part of a direct quote. Now, let me go ahead and tell you that in the length of papers that we'll do in my classes, there's really no reason for you to have a direct quote that's excessively long. In fact, there's something called a block quote. And a block quote is going to be a direct quote that goes beyond a certain number of lines. There's really no need to have block quotes for the length of papers we do in my class. They're useful for longer papers, but we're just not doing any papers that require that length. So what you can do, if you have a pretty long piece of quoted material that you want to quote, and you know that I don't want you to quote the whole entire thing, especially if it's like a paragraph long, you can skip around inside the quote. You can just quote maybe partial, you can quote a partial piece of a sentence, or you could quote one sentence earlier in the paragraph and then skip ahead to a later sentence. But anytime you skip in a direct quote, the three periods is, the ellipses is how you show that. Notice though that the ellipses, if you use it, you've also got to put a bracket around it, because the bracket shows that you have put these ellipses in and it was not a part of the original quote. A paraphrase is going to be an example of an indirect quote. Indirect quotes are where basically there's someone else's ideas, but you put those ideas in your own words. Paraphrase specifically is where you take a longer quote and you simplify it, you break it down. Keep in mind that since you put it in your own words, there's no need for you to use quotation marks. Like I said before, though, this is very useful if you had a paragraph that is a good paragraph, but you know that you can't quote the whole thing. I would suggest you use a paraphrase to simplify the idea. The idea may be said in like 4 or 5 sentences. Well, you may be able to simplify it to a sentence or two. Zoom out a little bit here. Quote attribution. This is going to be something that some of you may not have practiced yet, but it would be very important for you to get the hang of this, especially for my class. Basically, what you want to do is you want to avoid having a sentence that is a standalone quotation. What I mean by that, you don't want a sentence that starts with a direct quote, ends with the direct quote, and that's the whole sentence. Anytime you use a direct quote, you want to make sure you have at least 2 voices, whatever quoted material that you're using, and also your own voice. And your voice is what we call the quote attribution. You can do 2 things. One thing you could do is you could introduce the quote. I give an example here of A student here who's using a quote from Kermit the Frog, his famous expression, "It's not easy being green." If a writer wanted to introduce the quote, it's very easy to do. All the writer has to do is say, "Kermit the Frog argues, it's not easy being green." Notice that now you have, instead of just one voice, you have two voices. The more challenging way to do quote attribution is to explain the quote's significance. This can be very effective, though. This is basically your ability to bring in a direct quote and then relate it to your thesis. Keep in mind, this is very important, that anytime that you have a quote or paraphrase, before you move on to anything else, any other quotes or anything like that, you've got to tell how this direct quote or how this paraphrase proves your thesis. How does it move it forward? Avoid having back-to-back quotes, because that means that you've not paused to explain one quote's meaning for your argument before you move on to another. Alright, very important. This is going to be where we get into avoiding accusations of plagiarism. Okay, if you have both a parenthetical if you have an indirect quote or a direct quote, you must use a parenthetical citation. Even if they are someone else's, you're using someone else's idea, but you're putting it in your own words, you still have to have a parenthetical citation for where you found the idea. It's called intellectual property. You don't need to do parenthetical citations for established facts. There's a worksheet online that talks about it's a when to cite activity. So if you'd like some practice in deciding the difference between common knowledge and stuff that you should quote, check out that worksheet. Parenthetical citations, as far as the format, it can change. It depends on the amount of information you have. But usually, the parenthetical citation will have the author's last name and the page number. Sometimes, though, especially with web sources, you may not have the author. So basically, the standby format is an abbreviated form of the title of the article and the page number. Sometimes you may have a source that doesn't have page numbers. Well, if that's the case, then you just don't worry about a page number. You give what you can. If you refer to the author or title in context of the sentence, there's no need to repeat it. Basically what this means is if you do the quote attribution we talked about, and you say, here I give an example, King argues blank. Here I've said the last name of the author in the sentence, so in my parenthetical citation, there's no need for me to repeat King. The second example, though, notice that I just say one author argues. I've not specified King. So there at the end, the parenthetical citation does so. And then the last example there at the bottom, if I can get it here. Yeah, there we go. This is an example of an article that you may have an anonymous author. You don't know the name of the author. Notice here that I've got in my parenthetical citation an abbreviated form of the title. You don't need the whole title. Just enough to where the author, the reader, understands what entry to look at on the works cited page. Speaking of the works cited page, this is going to be the last page of the paper, so please don't just push enter a couple times after your conclusion and decide to stick that in there. The works cited page, there's really not a whole lot you need to memorize about it, because it's going to depend on what kind of source you have as far as how the works cited entries look. But there are a few things that you should memorize as far as the general format and how it looks, and this is going to be important for any kind of MLA quiz that we have.